Stuffed grape leaves. That's right, I'm going to show you how to make what most people refer to as dolmas. Well, actually, I'm going to show you how I make them at least, since I'm not exactly sure how authentic these are. I mean, it's not like I've ever had a dolmatician certify their accuracy, but nevertheless, I really do enjoy how these come out, and think you will as well. And by the way, we will be doing the less typical version that contains meat and rice. Usually it's just rice, but I really do love the meat-filled versions. So let's go ahead and get started with the stuffing. So we're going to start with some ground lamb, to which we're going to add some long grain rice, which I have not rinsed. I want all the starch. We're also going to need a nice glug of olive oil, and then we're going to throw in some currants for a little sweetness, as well as some pine nuts, but not for nuttiness, for richness. I really don't consider the flavor of pine nuts that nutty. And then, of course, like most stuffings, we have to season this aggressively. So we're going to need some salt, of course, and some freshly ground black pepper. We also want to do a little bit of cumin, as well as a touch of cinnamon. Not too much, but a little touch is very nice here. And then a little bit of herb. We'll do a pinch of dry oregano, as well as a good amount of freshly chopped mint, which of course pairs beautifully with lamb. Otherwise, how would you explain all the mint jelly being sold? I mean, no one's putting that on toast, right? And then last but not least, to bind this, we're going to do one whole egg. Then we'll take a fork and mix this thoroughly. And believe it or not, that's it for the stuffing. Very simple, very straightforward, and extremely flavorful. And then once that's mixed, we can just pop it in the fridge until our grape leaves are prepped, which is the next step. And I'm going to use the ones that come in the jar, and they do come packed in like a salty brine, which you can just go ahead and pour off. So let's transfer some of these to the cutting board so you can take a look. And no, I'm not finally doing that collab with Snoop Dogg. This is just a whole bunch of grape leaves all rolled up into a, let's say, cigar-like object. And by far the hardest part of this whole operation is unrolling these and separating the leaves without tearing them to pieces. So start off carefully, just slowly unroll it until you see what you're dealing with. And eventually, after a few frustrating seconds, they will start to come apart, and you can somehow, some way separate those leaves. But very important, you can't start stuffing as soon as you separate. We have to rinse that brine off the leaf. So as I'm doing this, I just like to transfer those into a large bowl of cold water. And I might leave those in for about 10 or 15 minutes to kind of leach out a little bit of that brininess. And I know some recipes call for blanching first. I find that completely unnecessary. But bottom line, before you start stuffing, you'll have to separate and rinse off your leaves. But once we do, we're ready to roll, literally. So let's go ahead and place one leaf flat down on a cutting board, and you'll notice they are ribbed. But not for anyone's pleasure. That's simply to tell us which side should be up. So we want the non-rib side down, those ribs facing up. And it should be pretty obvious, but if it's not, simply put whatever the smoothest side facing down. And then once we have our leaf properly positioned, we will place down a rounded tablespoon of our lamb and rice filling, pretty much right in the center, near the bottom of the leaf. And then what follows is how I like to roll these up. So I take the two pieces of the leaf at the bottom and fold those over like this. And then we'll carefully fold over each side, kind of keeping everything as symmetrical as we can. And once those sides are folded over, we just sort of tuck and roll with that last piece of leaf towards the front, and it should roll up into something that looks like that. And we do want to roll these sort of, but not too tight. Okay, they got to be tight enough to stay together, but if you roll them overly tight, they will break open as that rice expands as it cooks. And this is a little bit time consuming, but it goes way, way faster if you put like 6 or 8 leaves down on the cutting board at the same time, and then stuff and roll them one after the other. You should get a little bit of a rhythm down. And by the way, one of those jars is going to have more grape leaves than you need. So of course you're going to use the biggest and best leaves, but don't throw away the ugly and or torn ones, because we're going to use those as you'll see. So I continued rolling until my filling was gone. And for the amounts I'm using, you should get about 32 of these or so. And then once all our dolmas have been rolled, we can transfer those into our pot, but first we have to drizzle some olive oil on the bottom, and then cover it with some of our reserved excess grape leaves. All right, we want to insulate our rolled and stuffed grape leaves from the bottom. And then once that's set, we're going to go ahead and place these in, starting on the outside and working towards the middle. And very important, the dolmas should be just barely touching, but not smushed together. If they're too tight, they're just not going to cook properly. And on the other hand, if they're too loose, they will unravel. And for me, one batch will fill the bottom of my pot perfectly. But if you do have some gaps, no problem. Just wad up some grape leaves and fill those spaces. And by the way, you can do 2 or 3 layers of these, and the recipe will work just about the same. And then once those have been placed in properly, let's bring our pot over to the stove, and we will add the last couple ingredients, the first of which would be some fresh lemon juice. We'll just squeeze that over. And then we're also going to give it one last shot of olive oil, just a little drizzle over the top. And then we're going to need to pour our liquid in here. But before we do, incredibly important, we need something to keep these dolmas in place while they cook. And I'm going to do that with a couple plates. So I'm going to put a smaller one in the center, and then a bigger one over the top. And besides pressing everything down with a little bit of weight, it's also going to hold everything perfectly in place so these don't unwrap as they cook. And at that point, we can pour in our liquid. I'm using chicken broth. And once that's poured in, what we want to do is kind of tilt the pot to make sure we don't have any big air pockets underneath. So kind of tilt it this way and that. And at that point, we can turn on our heat to medium-high and wait for bubbles. And we're definitely not talking about waiting for a rolling boil. We're just waiting for our liquid to heat through and start to simmer. And as soon as we see that happen, here's the plan. We're going to reduce our heat to low, we're going to cover this, and we're going to cook it for about 45 minutes to an hour, or until our rice is perfectly tender. And what I like to do is let it go for about 35 minutes or so, at which point I like to remove my plates and kind of give them a test. They're usually not done by this point, but they're done enough to keep their shape. So at this point, I'm going to give them a little test with a fork. And as I push it in, I could feel that rice needed a little more. And also, they didn't look quite plumped up. Of course, that didn't stop me from eating one anyway, because I was starving. But they weren't quite done. So I decided to give these about another 10 minutes or so without the plates. The plates serve their purpose. So I just covered those up, cooked them, like I said, for another 10 minutes or so, until, like I said, the rice was perfectly tender. And you can see they do look a little plumper. And once we've determined our dolmas are perfectly cooked and our rice is tender, we are ready to serve. And here's the good news. These are great served hot, warm, room temperature, and cold. So I decided to serve them just barely warm as an appetizer. So I'm going to go ahead and line those up on a platter and garnish with a little bit of lemon zest. That's, of course, to distract people from all the holes I made testing them with a fork. And then I think I'm going to finish off with some fresh lemon juice. I've also had these served with a yogurt sauce, which is really good. So you could do that if you wanted. You are the John Cleese of your stuffed grape leaves. And I'm talking about the brilliant comedian John Cleese, not the character he played on Fawlty Towers, which, by the way, was one of the best shows ever. But I'm just going to do a little bit of fresh lemon, as well as one last drizzle of olive oil. And those lamb and rice stuffed grape leaves are done. Just gorgeous to look at, delicious to eat, and completely addictive. In fact, while I was eating these, I was like, why did you just make 32? I mean, those are going to be gone in, let's see, half minute divided in 16 minutes. So that was the only drawback. I didn't make enough. And like I said, these are typically made without the lamb, just with the rice and other spices. But I really do love the lamb in these, especially with that little sweetness from the currants and the mint and the cinnamon. Just a beautiful pairing with the tartness from the lemon and that kind of unique brininess of the grape leaf. It's just a fantastic thing to eat. So you've seen them on television, you've enjoyed them at your favorite Mediterranean restaurants, and now you have the technology to make these at home. And I really hope you give these a try soon.